Previously on this channel, I've covered the stories of MMA's biggest fake record frauds, guys who cherry-picked and lied their way to the UFC, using deceit to cover for their lack of elite level skill. But it got me thinking, if MMA can produce stories as wild as Askar Majarov and Sumit Kumar, surely a sport as corrupt and murky as boxing has also had its fair share of fake record frauds. And well, boxing absolutely did not disappoint, as in today's video we will cover the story of the most bizarre combat sports career I think I have ever seen. This video tells the story of Jorge Kahwagi, a man born into incredible wealth and power, but crippled by insecurity and a desire to step out from his father's shadow. And this desire for success of his own would lead to the fateful decision to enter the boxing ring and use his power and wealth to try and buy his way into a boxing career that he dreamt would give him the respect and accomplishment he craved. Instead, his attempt at a boxing career would bring him nothing other than ridicule and mockery, thanks to a string of blatantly rigged fights, along with his legendary fake muscle implants that ensure he remains a meme to this day. Let's get into the video. Jorge Kahwagi Jr. grew up in circumstances that most people could only dream of. Born in 1968 in Mexico City, George was the son of the extremely powerful Jorge Kahwagi Sr., a man who had left his mark on both Mexican media and Mexican politics by owning the La Crónica newspaper and running Mexico's national chambers of commerce at one point. The young Jorge Kahwagi grew up wanting for nothing, and he could have taken his life in any path that he chose. George claims his father also gave him his love of boxing, and he claims to have began training at the age of just 8. After completing his mandatory education at one of Mexico's top private schools, Kahwagi enrolled at the prestigious National Mexican University, pursuing a degree in law. While studying at UNAM, Kahwagi claims to have made his first foray into the world of amateur boxing. However, as you will see from the contents of this video, Kahwagi is a completely unreliable narrator, especially when it comes to his boxing escapades. So when he claims that he had an amateur record of 43-0 with 38 knockouts, I find it incredibly difficult to believe, not least because we have footage of him boxing and he is genuinely awful. Unless he exclusively fought people with physical disabilities, I find 43-0 hard to believe, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Despite apparently being a boxing phenom, Kahwagi would instead focus on education, getting his degree in law and also getting a degree in business administration from a different Mexican university. Predictably, Kahwagi would then manage to land a job at his father's La Crónica media company, quickly rising through the ranks, and before long, he was vice president and earning a hefty salary at a very young age. When he wasn't working, Kahwagi was out in Mexico City rubbing shoulders with fellow elites, and he was considered something of a socialite, with elite connections no doubt aided by his father's ability to get doors opened for his son. And Kahwagi would continue to tread the same path as his father when he opted to make his move into politics. With his father already well connected politically, Kahwagi Jr. was able to secure himself a seat in Mexico's lower Congress as a member of the Green Party. But his political career seems to have been very uneventful, with the only notable event from his time in politics being when he asked for time off from his job in office so that he could enter Mexico's version of Big Brother. Kahwagi was allowed to enter the show, and he would end up spending 50 days in the Big Brother house, finishing in 3rd place. Not exactly the actions of a politician serious about improving the life of those he was supposed to be serving, but Kahwagi enjoyed the boost in profile that the show was able to provide him. Perhaps unsurprisingly, however, his lofty political ambitions were taking longer to achieve than he had initially anticipated, with his father's influence only able to take him so far in politics. And by his early 30s, he hadn't been able to make any real inroads into a more prestigious position. From the outside looking in, it seemed like Kahwagi had everything going for him. He was rich, he was powerful, he was well connected, and he had achieved some level of fame. But on the inside, Kahwagi was a man crippled by insecurity and an overarching sense of a lack of real achievement, perhaps feeling that everything in his life was a direct result of his father's influence and power. This crippling insecurity would manifest itself in various ways, one of which being the plastic surgery Kahwagi would opt for over the years. slowly altering his appearance until he reached the point of ridiculousness. But this insecurity would also be the impetus for the next career change Kahwagi would undergo, as he made the fateful decision to pursue a career in professional boxing, despite being in his early 30s and having not trained seriously since his university days. And I'm not even sure if he trained seriously back then either. In Kahwagi's mind, a glittering career in boxing was the perfect way of achieving something independent of his father in a sport deeply entrenched in Mexican culture. The respect and admiration he hoped to achieve in the ring would also bring the added benefit of perhaps reigniting his career in politics, with the public enamored by the man who could just do it all. On paper, the plan seemed perfect, but there was just one issue. Jorge Kahwagi is a genuinely terrible boxer, and no amount of money spent on training and sparring could change the fact that he was not capable of competing at a professional level. So Jorge Kahwagi decided to spend his money on buying off his opponents, embarking on a career defined by fraud and disgrace. By the time Kahwagi would make his professional boxing debut, he was 32 years old. This is an age where some fighters are actually beginning to wind down their career, but Kahwagi believed he was still young enough to build himself a career in the sport that would earn him the respect and admiration he so desperately desired. Or did he believe that he was still young enough to compete? Because his actions from the outset of his career suggest he knew exactly just how bad he was, and he would do anything to cover it up. The one saving grace of Kahwagi's reputation that prevents this embarrassing and cringeworthy fraud from being more widely well known is the lack of available information, and in particular footage of his early fights, due to the time period they took place in, with Kahwagi's debut taking place all the way back in 2001. This lack of footage is an issue that was remedied later in his career, but most of his early bouts unfortunately do not seem to have any video. Kahwagi's pro boxing career began in November of 2001 with a fight booked against a fellow debutant in Perry Williams. Kahwagi would start his career off with a bang with a first round knockout in what seemed like an easy debut against an overmatched opponent to get the wheels rolling on his career. In reality, however, this fight was anything but simple. His opponent on the night in Perry Williams would go on to have one more professional fight, losing again before finding himself embroiled in an FBI investigation codenamed Operation Matchbook, which alleged he had been paid to lose his second fight, with his opponent in Joey Torres being an undercover FBI informant. This investigation included an alleged wiretap in which an official from Top Rank Boxing instructed Perry on which punch he should go down from. Perry Williams was banned from boxing and would never fight again. It's worth noting that his fight against Kahwagi was not part of the FBI investigation, but if he was paid off in his only other pro bout, then it's definitely feasible that a man as rich and desperate as Kahwagi also chucked him a bribe before their fight. And if it seems harsh to assume the worst for Kahwagi, that's only because I know what's coming later. And once you've heard the full story, I'm sure you will agree that on the balance of probability, Kahwagi's first ever fight was a complete fix. Kahwagi's debut win over Perry Williams was followed up by another first round knockout, this time of Darrell Brown, becoming the only man to ever knock Darrell Brown out in his 9-fight career, with Brown deciding to never fight again after feeling the power of Kahwagi. In just Kahwagi's third ever fight, the vacant Mexican cruiserweight title was on the line against a fighter with an 0-4 career record. Now that might seem dodgy, and it probably was, but in fairness, there's not a ton of Mexican cruiserweights to begin with. Unsurprisingly, Kahwagi would win the Mexican Cruiserweight Championship, and for the third time in a row, he knocked his opponent out in the very first round. His opponent on the night in George Lopez would never fight again, retiring with a 0-5 career record. For the next two bouts of his burgeoning career, Kahwagi would head over to Spain to fight. Firstly, picking up yet another first round knockout in an uninteresting bout against a fighter with a career record of 0-1. However, his second fight in Spain was interesting, because his opponent in Richard Wilson just so happened to be another fighter who was later wrapped up in the FBI's Operation Matchbook as a fighter suspected of throwing fights. A consistent loser with a career record of 13 wins and 64 losses, Wilson was knocked out by Kahwagi in the very first round of their fight. There is no hard evidence that this fight with Kahwagi was rigged, but to share another bout with a man strongly suspected of throwing fights was a bad look. But with a shiny 5-0 record and a 100% first-round knockout rate, Kahwagi was ready for a step up in competition, and he was duly handed it by the WBC, who offered him a shot at the vacant WBC International Cruiserweight title against Alexei Osokin of Russia. Osokin was a fighter with a record of 11 wins and 14 losses at the time of the Kahwagi fight, and he was certainly nothing special. But with one of the WBC's 5 million belts being on the line, it was the perfect incentive for Kahwagi to make sure he got the job done. This fight took place in Russia, and unsurprisingly, Kawagi's unstoppable power was too much for Osokin, who crumbled in the very first round. And with that, Jorge Kahwagi was your WBC International Cruiserweight Champion. But it brings me great pleasure to tell you that Kahwagi and Osokin would decide that after such an epic bout, they had to run it back and do a rematch. And thankfully, footage of their fight in Mexico City does exist, although I must warn you, the quality is terrible. But you don't need 1080p to appreciate the pure punching power of Jorge Kahwagi. In a truly dreadful fight, Osokin first goes down from a pathetically weak punch, but realizes it looked too suspicious to be a knockdown and tries to wave it off unsuccessfully. After somehow surviving the ref's count, the bout continues until Kahwagi stops the show with a savage blow that sends Osokin flying theatrically as if he was just hit by prime Mike Tyson, with the fight waved off after he failed to beat the count. Given just how embarrassing this fight looked, it's fair to assume this fight was rigged. Their first fight in Russia was also probably rigged, and I suspect every bout Kahwagi ever competed in was fixed. His boxing career was a complete joke to anyone unlucky enough to be in attendance for one of his fights, and I use the term fights very loosely. But his most embarrassing moments in the ring were still yet to come, as Kahwagi seemingly lacked any level of shame to sense how bad things could get if more people saw how fake his fights were. Mexican boxing fans are way too smart to be fooled by something that looks as bad as these fights, and his attempt at a boxing career was never going to bring him the plaudits Kahwagi was hoping for. Perhaps it was the embarrassment of the last fight that would lead Kahwagi to seek out a more impressive opponent for his next bout, hoping to buy some legitimacy on the back of his next opponent's credentials. The opponent in question, Buck Smith, is an interesting character in his own right. His remarkable career saw him compete in an extraordinary 205 bouts, with countless more exhibitions not counted on his record. Of these 205 fights, he would win 183 of them, and treated boxing like a 9 to 5, taking bouts as regularly as possible, even if it meant fighting truly terrible competition all across America. By the time Buck Smith was contacted by Jorge Kahwagi for a fight, Buck was 37 years old and his career was definitely on the tail end, with 5 losses in a row, including one against Julio Cesar Chavez 4 years prior. Even though his career was approaching the end, surely Buck would be a serious problem for someone as bad as Jorge Kahwagi. Had Kahwagi bitten off more than he could chew in Buck Smith? Well, Kahwagi would surprise, or maybe not surprise people, by knocking Buck Smith out in just one round, just like every other opponent he had fought so far. It took Julio Cesar Chavez 3 rounds to get Buck Smith out of the ring when they'd fought, but Kawagi's unstoppable power had been just too much. Had Father Time truly caught up to Buck Smith, or was there something more nefarious at play here? Footage of the fight doesn't seem to exist, so I guess we will never know for sure. But in all of Buck Smith's 200 plus fights, Kahwagi was the first and only man to knock him out in less than 3 rounds. Impressive, I guess. In an unrelated note, Buck Smith was yet another figure later caught up in the FBI's Operation Matchbook investigation into match fixing in boxing, and he was called to testify before a grand jury in 2004. Buck has strenuously denied ever taking part in rigged fights, but it's yet another Kahwagi opponent who fought suspiciously bad against Kahwagi before later being accused of throwing fights. Just a funny coincidence, I guess. After beating Buck Smith, Kahwagi would have 2 more fights in Mexico, of course winning both via KO, although these wins came in the second round rather than the first round. The first time in his career that Kahwagi had ever been out of the first round. With Kahwagi at a 10-0 record as of 2004, we had footage of just 1 fight, and even that appears to have only surfaced in recent years. Kahwagi wasn't fooling any boxing fans into thinking he was a legit fighter. But to the uneducated, he was possibly able to fool them into thinking he was a politician, businessman, and fighter extraordinaire, because he'd beaten decent opponents like Buck Smith and had a glitzy record of first-round knockouts and a few title belts that he could show off. Unfortunately for Kahwagi, however, he couldn't quit while he was ahead, and his next two fights would unfortunately for him have footage, and they would completely and utterly torpedo any credibility he had been able to build, exposing him as one of boxing's biggest ever frauds and making him a laughingstock in boxing circles to this very day. Aged 37, Kahwagi had bought himself a 10-0 record and had won belts like the WBC Latino Cruiserweight title and the WBC International Cruiserweight title. He was never going to go down in history like Canelo, but given he was a truly awful boxer, his money had managed to buy him a boxing career that looked better on paper than the vast majority of those who get into the sport. At this stage, he should have just called it quits, and really there were only downsides to taking more fights. But Kawagi's ego would not let him walk away, and he decided to take another fight in 2005, and unbelievably, he told the media that he still believed he could win a world title. But this fight would provide the best evidence yet of how fraudulent his boxing career truly was, with footage of this fight existing, as well as journalist accounts of how the fight played out, along with the reaction of those unlucky enough to watch this sham unfold in front of their eyes. The fight was booked for July 2005 against experienced practitioner Roberto Coelho, a man who would be fighting in his 50th pro bout. His record of 33 wins and 17 losses wasn't spectacular, but it was decent enough. However, his career was definitely coming to an end, having won just 2 of his last 12 fights as he entered his late 30s. A boxer on the downslide and heading towards retirement looking for one last payday was the perfect target for Kahwagi, and a bout between the pair was organised as the co-main event of a fight card being held in Baja California in Mexico, with Kahwagi looking to chart a course to a world title. From the admittedly poor quality footage that exists, we can see Coelho control the first round while Kahwagi swings wildly and misses in dramatic fashion, with shocking form over and over again. Coelho was perhaps unaware of just how bad Kahwagi was, and it seems it took him a little bit to figure out how difficult it would be to look like he got legitimately beaten by someone this bad. It is genuinely comical at times, and I think Coelho almost forgot his assignment, as he looked to be having fun dodging Kawagi's pathetically telegraphed swings while landing a few punches of his own. As the first round ended, the fans, almost all of whom were seeing Kahwagi fight for the first time, were left bewildered by what they had witnessed, as he looked like a fish out of water. But in the break between rounds, it seems Coelho was reminded of what was expected of him, and in the second round, he suspiciously completely stopped throwing punches of any real intention, allowing Kahwagi to desperately unload punches on him at will, before Coelho threw himself to the floor. It was now abundantly clear to everyone watching that this fight was a complete fix, and as Coelho bravely made his way back to his feet to beat the count, the fans in attendance began throwing objects in the ring and voicing their discontent at the nonsense they'd paid to watch. Kahwagi showed his imperious power to drop Coelho again, and as objects poured into the ring from a furious crowd, Kahwagi was declared the winner of this shambolic fight. Both boxers were booed as they left the ring, with people screaming fraud and continuing to pelt them with objects. Kahwagi would attempt to explain away the weird nature of the fight by saying he had 14 stitches in his mouth and injuries to his nose and hand that had stopped him from performing his best, but that did nothing to satisfy critics, with one Mexican boxing official urging Kahwagi to stop boxing for the sake of the sport and the fans. This fight had finally generated him a decent level of publicity, but it was all the wrong publicity, and he had been properly exposed as a complete fraud, with the grainy footage there to prove it. This fight should have been the last time we ever saw Kahwagi grace the boxing ring, given the man was 37 years old and had completely blown all credibility with the disgrace of his last fight. And for many years it looked like we had seen the last of him. But Kahwagi is not a normal person, and the same insecurities and hunger for real achievement that had drawn him to the ring in the first place would inexplicably draw him back for one last fight. And the craziest part is, this fight took place 10 years after the fiasco with Coelho, with Kahwagi making the crazy decision to come back to boxing in 2015 at the age of 47. And once again, there was no hiding from the cameras as Kahwagi had done earlier in his career, as this fight was to be shown live on TV. With his reputation in Mexican boxing shot to bits, unsurprisingly, Kawagi's return to the ring would come outside of his home country. An event taking place in Cebu City in the Philippines had an exciting last-minute addition when it was announced that Jorge Kahwagi and Roman Olivas would be fighting in a cruiserweight bout, something of a novelty in the Philippines which rarely sees cruiserweight action. This was by no means a noteworthy fight card, and it would have gone completely forgotten if not for the last-minute addition of this Kahwagi bout, which will live on forever in infamy. God only knows the motivations of Kahwagi for deciding to do this fight. Perhaps the embarrassment of his last fight being captured on film and the ridicule it generated meant he wanted a more legitimate-looking fight to try and recapture some level of dignity. But if that was his aim, he failed miserably. This fight was ridiculous before the bell had even rung, with Kahwagi sporting extremely large muscles befitting a bodybuilder rather than a fighter. But this was no result of steroids. Kahwagi had made the inexplicable decision to get fake muscle implants, which when combined with the plastic surgery he'd gotten on his face, made him look like a cartoon character. Unfortunately, the self-image issues that he dealt with seemed to have escalated to an extreme level, and the ridiculousness of the muscle implants would be made more apparent when it came time for Kahwagi to actually move about and throw some punches. Kahwagi seemed to have such little control of his movement as a result of the implants, and he could barely move to the point you could hear the crowd audibly laughing at the absurdity of what they were watching. At this point of the video, it's just so blatantly obvious his fights were rigged, and it seems Olivas was perhaps a little too eager to fulfill his duties of losing, as less than a minute into the bout, he throws himself to the floor from a pathetic punch. In fact, he was so eager to take the dive that I think Kahwagi was actually pissed off by how unconvincing he made the dive look. Despite the heavy blow he'd just taken, Olivas somehow beat the count, but perhaps it would have been better for both men if he just stayed down. The commentators openly mocked Kahwagi as the fight continued, with one of them remarking that Kahwagi was a fraud who threw punches in slow motion.
Stein said Kahwagi is a fraud. He throws punches in slow motion.
After getting floored, Olivas soaked up more punishment before eventually just folding over and giving up, with the ref thankfully stepping in and waving off the fight, with everyone having seen enough. Kahwagi is lucky this fight took place in the Philippines because a less polite crowd would have no doubt given him a harder time than the stunned crowd in Cebu City. As Kahwagi had his hand raised in front of a bemused crowd, the curtain came down on the most fraudulent boxing career I have ever seen in my life. Accounts of his earlier fights are limited, but those that do exist paint the same picture, time and time again, of fights where his opponents had no real intentions of winning and had been paid off to lose backstage. Kahwagi had entered the ring seeking achievement and acclaim independent of his father, and he envisioned a storied career that would propel him to the highest level of Mexican politics. But as he left the ring in Cebu City, his legacy was one of fraud and ridicule, as one of boxing's most embarrassing fighters. In the years since his last fight in the Philippines, Kahwagi has stepped back from the limelight a bit and has resumed his duties working as president of his father's media organization. His political ambitions seem to have died a death after the furore surrounding his decision to enter Mexico's version of Big Brother. And besides a health scare, Kahwagi has largely been absent from the headlines and thankfully absent from the ring too. Kahwagi had a head start in life that most people could only dream of, but that didn't seem to make him happy. Unfortunately, this discontent and a desire to prove himself led to him making the terrible decision to try and buy his way to a career in boxing, and a seeming lack of shame meant this foray into boxing went way further than it ever should have, resulting in one of the most memeable fights of all time. Jorge Kahwagi absolutely belongs in the rogues gallery of fake record frauds, with a career so disgraceful that I'm not sure it can ever be topped. But if it has been topped, then you can be sure that I will one day make a video on it. The end. Thank you so much for watching the video. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and check out my last video on the MMA prodigy who threw away his UFC career. If you like football or American football, then check out my other channels linked in the description below, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.